chance compared to the last few days, but still a lot of cloud floating about. Whether you've got the grey skies or the blue, however, 4 to 6 degrees generally into the afternoon, so feeling on the chilly side. Still quite breezy in the southwest. Elsewhere, more widely, I think cloud breaks through tonight, and as a result, a more widespread frost forming. Certainly a colder start to Wednesday across Scotland, England and Wales, with temperatures in towns and cities around 0, but in the countryside a few degrees below. Northern Ireland the exception, southwest England also, where thicker cloud and a breeze, along with some outbreaks of rain, will prevent a frost and a wet start for Northern Ireland during the morning. That rain pushing into southwest Scotland by lunchtime, and a narrower band of some heavy rain pushing through Wales and the southwest during the afternoon. That brings milder air along with a keen breeze, but further east we keep that chilly air in place, and along the meeting area of those two air masses, chances of some snow over the Scottish mountains, perhaps the top of the Pennines as well. Thursday and Friday stay unsettled. It'll be mild in the south, colder further north.
Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
You're watching GB News live across the UK and the world on our digital stream.
GB News is Britain's news channel.
We are the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
We are here for you. Don't forget to join our YouTube community by clicking on that subscribe button.
And if you want the GB News app, you can click and catch up on programmes anytime.
We love to hear from you, so email us.
gbviews@gbnews.uk.
Thanks for being part of the GB News family.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else, I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GB News.
Cabinet indecision, Christmas restriction, hospitality creaking and questions of leadership. Good morning, happy Christmas. It's 9 o'clock and you're watching The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood. We have a jam-packed programme for you today, all kicking off after your news with Rosie Wright.
A very good morning, I'm Rosie Wright. Let's get you up to date at 9 o'clock. Now, new COVID restrictions in England are unlikely to be introduced before Christmas, but the Prime Minister says the government won't rule out further action. Boris Johnson says the data is being monitored hourly and the arguments for stricter guidance are very finely balanced. Meanwhile, the Financial Times is reporting that a senior government insider has confirmed there are no plans to introduce new restrictions this side of Christmas. The former Chief Medical Officer at Bupa, Dr Andrew Vallance-Owen, says measures must be brought in very soon to protect the NHS.
We already now have one of the highest, in fact, it's over 100,000 cases a day now, and it's going up and up. And I feel that if we don't bring in restrictions, as many other countries in Europe are doing, either we're not going to bring them in before Christmas. People want Christmas saved, but I think immediately after we will have to, or the NHS will just not be able to cope, and we will be back where we were with real problems.
The World Health Organization is urging leaders and individuals to make difficult decisions now, declaring that 2022 must be the year that the pandemic ends. The Director General is warning that the Omicron variant is spreading significantly faster than the Delta strain, and it's infecting people who are already vaccinated. The variant has already been identified in 89 countries across the world. He's also urged caution over the festive period, saying an event cancelled is better than a life cancelled.
2022 must be the year we end the pandemic, but it must also be the year that all countries invest in preventing a future disaster on this scale. In the year ahead, WHO is committed to doing everything in our power to end the pandemic and to beginning a new era in global health.
The government has announced £360 million to support homeless people and those at risk of losing their homes. Well, the move follows a warning from the charity Shelter that more than 274,000 people are homeless in England on any given night. The homelessness prevention grant is going to help people find a new home, get help with evictions, or help people move into temporary accommodation. The government has pledged more than £2 billion in funding over the next 3 years to try to tackle homelessness. 4 out of 10 patients seen by GPs are regarded as frequent attenders at their surgery. Research by the University of Manchester suggests that the top 10% of patients who make a disproportionate number of visits take up 40% of GP appointments. Co-author of the report, Professor Evan Contrepelis, says that it's not the patient's fault, but a broken system where there's a lack of funding and not enough doctors.
About the system and how the system actually might not resolve existing health problems for these patients, and they have to go back to the GPs again and again. But we have seen an increase over time in that group of patients, highlighting, in our view, a systemic problem. There has been less money for community services. Mental health services have moved away, so they're less accessible to people locally.
Omicron is now the dominant variant of coronavirus in the US. It accounts for 73% of new infections across the country. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention numbers showed a nearly 6-fold increase in Omicron's cases in 1 week. The variant is responsible for an estimated 90% of new infections in the New York area and the southeast. The national rate suggests more than 650,000 Omicron cases occurred in the US last week. The US White House press secretary has reiterated the importance of being vaccinated.
For those who choose to remain unvaccinated, he'll issue a stark warning and make clear unvaccinated individuals will continue to drive hospitalizations and deaths. That is not trying to scare people, or maybe it is trying to make clear to people in the country what the risks are here of not being vaccinated.
Now, a 326-million-year-old fossil of a giant millipede has been found in Northumberland. By fluke, it was found after a section of cliff fell onto the shore. Experts say giant millipedes as long as a car and weighing 50 kilograms were once roaming in the north of England. You are up to date. I'll be back with your headlines in half an hour. For now, let's go to the briefing with Tom Harwood.
Indecision. That was the result of yesterday's marathon, almost 3-hour-long cabinet meeting on the prospect of new restrictions. Indecision that leaves families and businesses in the lurch. Indecision that allows the virus to continue to rip through the population each passing day. Indecision that stifles economic activity and raises the collective blood pressure of the nation. But worse than the fact of this stuttering delay is what the government's new holding position appears to be. According to most reliable reports, as the price for, quote, saving Christmas, we may be whacked with more severe restrictions in January. To repeat, the government is considering allowing the biggest weekend of intergenerational mixing of the year, despite the absolute peak of Omicron during that peak, only to then slam restrictions after that fact. Imposing no measures now and then harsh restrictions in the new year is the definition of shutting the door after the horse has bolted. If there's going to be unbearable pressure on the NHS, that will be created from Christmas Day mixing. Doing nothing for Christmas and then acting harshly after is beyond boneheaded. It's to say younger people should not be concerned about mixing with their grandparents, but once Christmas is over and they return home, it forbids them from mixing with their own generation. This worst of both worlds halfway house makes no epidemiological sense. I genuinely cannot describe the scale of my frustration at how incompetent this strategy appears to be. Either enact temporary restrictions before Christmas or don't act. The current government mindset is going to kill more people and restrict our liberties more afterwards. How on earth has it got this far? The current thinking of this government is genuinely resignation-worthy. The time for clear advice, potentially even limits on mixing, is now. The time for restriction is certainly not post-Christmas. I could live with time-limited restrictions over the Christmas weekend. I really could. It's important to avoid having older or more vulnerable people infected at the same time, on the same weekend. One weekend of measures, or better yet, clear, concise advice, and the incentive of an alternative post-peak celebration, a January bank holiday perhaps, to encourage mixing later on, would not be the worst idea in the world. What would be, in my view, the worst idea in the world is the trajectory we are currently on. The utility of post-Christmas restriction is close to nil, and the social cost is incredibly high. If the Prime Minister were to bring in post-Christmas restrictions that go as far as banning indoor mixing, not only would vast swathes of this country simply not comply, Tory MPs would be right to send in their letters and bring this stuttering administration down. Well, those were my thoughts on the current political situation. But after yesterday's cabinet meeting, Boris explained his own indecision.
He agreed that we should keep the data from now on under constant review, keep following it hour by hour. And unfortunately, I must say to people, we will have to reserve the possibility of taking further action to protect the public. And to protect public health, to protect our NHS.
But what are the political factors behind this indecision? Is it right to wait for more data? And as Omicron continues to surge, will we end up with a halfway house that pleases absolutely no one at all? Well, let's talk to John Rentoul, chief political commentator at The Independent. Welcome to the programme, John. Are we right to believe what we heard about this cabinet meeting yesterday, that the Prime Minister is absolutely stuck between a rock and a hard place, between his backbenchers on one side and scientists on the other?
Well, yes, we've had a virtually blow-by-blow account of a 2 to 3 hour cabinet Zoom meeting. And it's not clear from that whether the Prime Minister is weak or Machiavellian. I mean, is he saying to his cabinet, you take the decision. For once, he's being collegiate and working as a team because he knows this is an extremely difficult decision and he wants to spread the responsibility for it. And he's also saying to the scientific advisors, look, if it's not me, if you can't persuade my cabinet, because they had a chance at the beginning of the meeting, or Chris Whitty had a chance at the beginning of the meeting. If you can't persuade them, then why do you think I should overrule them? So it's an absolutely fascinating moment in politics, and as you say, it ended up with a non-decision, which is of course a decision, but it's a decision you disagree with.
I suppose it's a decision to delay any decision. One thing that I was interested in these readouts and various reports of this cabinet meeting is just how much Sajid Javid seems to have swung from an anti-restriction position to a pro-restriction position. Why do you think that might be?
Well, it might be because he's Secretary of State for Health and that he has the closest responsibility for dealing with the pandemic, in which case he has been, it depends on your point of view, he's either been captured by the Department of Health or he understands the problem better than some of his colleagues. I wouldn't like to be in any of these people's position. I do think it's an extremely difficult decision. I don't agree with your analysis, Tom. I think it's extremely finely balanced, and I think there is a question as to what the data actually justifies. And I think the Prime Minister has decided to allow other people to make that decision for him.
I think, though, that this idea of delay, of waiting, is just repeating these mistakes that this government has made over the past 2 years.
Well, not necessarily, because we're in a different situation now, aren't we? We're a more or less fully vaccinated population. And the Prime Minister hasn't always got it wrong. He was right to release the restrictions in July. He was criticised at the time. And waiting is not necessarily a bad idea. I mean, I know everybody says, obviously the thing about rising infections is you've got to act early and act hard. But the question is, to what extent those rising figures justify that, and we just don't know that. We just don't know how serious this is, and the precautionary principle can be taken too far.
I certainly agree with you on that point. So I would just say that, as far as I understand it, as much as I've read, the scientific advisors and the chief medical advisor were saying that Christmas is the real danger point. That if anything needs to be done, it needs to be done around Christmas. And then the politicians come and say, no, we want to save Christmas, so we'll do much harsher restrictions later. Is that not shutting the doors after the horse has already bolted?
Yeah, no, I think that's daft. But on the other hand, I wasn't there. I didn't hear what Chris Whitty had to say. I mean, I've heard what he said in public. But if he can't persuade cabinet ministers in that kind of situation that this is absolutely obviously the right thing to do, then I think it must be a very difficult decision. It must be 50-50. And I'm not going to, I can't be sure which side of that argument I would come down on if I were in that position.
Certainly not an enviable position, especially after last weekend and the resignation of Lord Frost. This is all now being viewed through the prism of potential leadership, and various briefings, various newspapers have accounts of how heroic Rishi Sunak was, or Liz Truss was, or Jacob Rees-Mogg was. To what extent is the leadership prism really distorting this debate around the cabinet table?
Well, that is a very interesting question. And I think that there's clearly an element of that. I think the Prime Minister is in a weaker position than he has been for some time. But on the other hand, I simply do not believe that there are as many as 55 Conservative MPs who think it's a good idea to change leader right now. So in that sense, I don't believe that Boris Johnson's under immediate threat of losing his job. So, but there's no question that that is the centre of gravity of the Conservative Party, that the leadership contenders want to appeal to those 101 Conservative MPs who rebelled against the government on Tuesday last week.
I think if the government were to announce some sort of ban or intention to ban indoor mixing, maybe for a month, maybe for the whole of January, there would not be enough irate backbench Conservative MPs who would put forward their letter. I mean, just from a personal perspective, I think I've been probably closer to Michael Gove than Mark Harper on a lot of the stuff over the last 2 years. But the idea of post-Christmas, further restrictions, nearing lockdown, banning indoor mixing, that really sent me over the edge last night. And I think that were I sitting on those green benches and that were to happen, I'd be writing my letter at that point.
Yeah, but who would you want as leader instead? And that's the difficult question.
I suppose that is a very interesting question. And of course, we do hear a number of names in this conversation. We hear Rishi Sunak, we hear Liz Truss, We hear a couple of backbench names. I've heard Tom Tugendhat being thrown around before. Are there any other names that you think might well put themselves forward? What are the chances of someone like Mark Harper stepping up?
Well, he tried last time. He got 10 nominations. I think Penny Mordaunt is someone that people often forget, who's lying in wait, shall we say, for another chance. But I mean, I think it is essentially a contest between Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss at this moment. But I don't think we're going to come to that. I don't think there is going to be a leadership contest imminently, and I don't think. I mean, you say that there's a danger of restrictions being imposed after Christmas. I think that will only happen if the figures for the spread of the virus are so overwhelming and so clear that there won't be much of an argument about what action needs to be taken. Now, you may say that action will be too late, but it won't. I don't think it will look. I don't think it'll look odd by the time we get to the new year, because I think the information that the scientists are waiting for is going to be available by then.
The most irritating thing about that course of action is that most of the modelling, certainly that I've seen, is that we're expecting the peak of Omicron infection to come around the time between Christmas and New Year, the natural peak of that, just because it will have burnt through so many people in the country. So if restrictions were imposed at that point anyway, it would be incredibly hard to tell if the restrictions were what caused the drop after that peak, or if that was the natural course of the virus anyway, and the restrictions have done nothing, and the attitude around Christmas has killed a lot of people.
Well, that was the argument that people made in March 2020. And actually, all the evidence looking back was that the infections peaked before the lockdown, or at least before the statutory lockdown. What mattered was people changing their behaviour, and people have already changed their behaviour this time. People are not having a normal Christmas this weekend. People have already locked themselves down voluntarily to a large extent. So you're quite right. If it peaks next week, it won't be clear why that will be. And I think if it does peak next week, you're quite right. I don't think restrictions would then be justified because, in a sense, that it's already too late.
Well, it is a fascinating decision to be made. And just finally in this conversation, John, when do we expect the government to be announcing something? Should we be expecting something later today?
Well, I think we could expect something in the form of guidance today or tomorrow. That wouldn't require the recall of Parliament. I mean, I think one of the things that Boris Johnson has done in his weakness is to run down the clock so that there is no time to recall Parliament before Christmas. So if anything happens before Christmas, it'll be guidance, possibly along the lines of what Nicola Sturgeon did in Scotland about restricting household mixing. But as I say, I think that's happening anyway. And so if then after Christmas, you might recall Parliament in between Christmas and the New Year, but that would depend on what the course of the infections and hospitalisations looked like at that point. And I think we will be in a much clearer position. I think we will know what to do then. I mean, you will say it's too late, but I think it will then be obvious, and the political dilemma will fall away.
Well, a very busy 2 weeks for political journalists, no doubt. But for now, John Rentoul, Chief Political Commentator at The Independent, thank you very much for joining us this morning on The Briefing. Fascinating discussion there. Well, the debate over Christmas restrictions may feel like Groundhog Day, but there's a difference. Leadership discussions, the lowest Tory polling since the summer of 2019, and questions over the credibility of the Prime Minister. Well, let's speak now to Chris Curtis, the head of political polling at the research group Opinium. Welcome to the programme, Chris. Just how unpopular is the Prime Minister at the moment?
Good morning, Tom. Well, he certainly isn't the most unpopular Prime Minister the country's ever had, but he's not particularly far off anymore, and it's certainly the most unpopular point we've ever seen for Boris Johnson. Very roughly speaking, the views of Boris Johnson now are about the same as what we were seeing for Theresa May in her final months before she was booted out of office. And this has been happening sort of fairly slowly over the past couple of months. He peaked with fairly high approval ratings in May earlier this year after those local election results, during the quite successful vaccine rollout, and he's been slowly going down ever since. Really accelerated, though, by the release of that Allegra Stratton video and then all of the accusations that have come out ever since then about parties in Downing Street last year.
Seem to have undoubtedly done a huge amount of damage, not only in opinion polls, but also in real-world data with that by-election last week. My question is, has a Prime Minister been able to bounce back from a low this low before in recent history?
Certainly not one that comes to mind. Usually when a Prime Minister reaches this point, it's very, very hard for them to come back to that from this. The sort of leader that could probably came closest to bouncing back from a situation like this was Margaret Thatcher back in the early 80s, when her first few years as Prime Minister went sort of fairly badly. She became incredibly unpopular quite quickly. But then the war in the Falklands happened, and that allowed her reputation to bounce back. Now, look, I don't think there is a winnable short war with a South American country on the horizon. But Boris Johnson probably does need something of that size in order to improve his approval ratings.
Don't give this Prime Minister any ideas. That might be a much more interesting 2022 than people were expecting. Just let's zoom out now and look at the broad political landscape. The Labour Party ahead in the polls quite considerably in some polls, 8 points, I think, in one poll last week. Interestingly also, some of the minor parties doing well. The Lib Dems up a bit, the Greens up a bit. Is it too early to make guesses at what future electoral events might show?
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And I think one of the key reasons for that, to be blunt, is that we don't actually know who the leader of the Conservative Party is going to be going into the next election. I think that there is now at least a very reasonable chance that the Conservatives will replace Boris Johnson and bring somebody else in instead. New leaders of parties get the opportunity to sort of set out a new narrative, set a new direction. They usually get a honeymoon period at the start, which allows them to slightly change the dynamics of politics. So if the Conservatives do bring in a new leader, that could give them an opportunity to start bouncing back, and maybe this Labour lead that we're seeing in the polls at the moment could start to evaporate. Also, there could be another sort of crisis like the pandemic, which could give the Conservatives a similar opportunity to set out a new narrative. Personally, I think that the Conservatives' best argument, the thing that best differentiates them from the Labour Party in the minds of the public, is to do with the economy. Despite the fact that we're over a decade on from that big financial crash, people still don't trust Labour on the economy. People still have a view that they sort of borrow too much money and spend too much money. I think that's the argument that the Conservatives should be trying to hammer home against the Labour Party if they want to stand any chance of staying in office after the next election.
Although I suppose they've damaged their credibility on that by amount of money themselves, raising taxes, and now we're facing the highest inflation that we've seen in 40 years. That's a bit of a perilous position for this government, especially if it wants to present itself as one of economic competence. I wonder, though, with the Labour Party being ahead by quite a considerable amount in some polls, is that because the Tory party are doing badly, or is there something that this new version, this new iteration of the Labour Party is doing right? Is any of that cutting through?
Well, there's always a bit of both, and politics and elections are a zero-sum game. So if somebody's doing badly, the other person has to start doing well. But I think it's definitely fair to say that this is probably more caused by Boris Johnson specifically, but also the Conservatives doing badly, than Labour doing well. Keir Starmer's approval ratings are all right. They're not great. They're certainly not at the levels that we were seeing for Tony Blair last time Labour entered office. But, the real driver, I think, is Boris Johnson's personal unpopularity at this moment in time.
Well, let's see if that continues and whether that may change, go up or down if restrictions are brought in over the next week or so. But for now, Chris Curtis from Opinium, that research polling agency. Thank you very much for joining us this morning on The Briefing. Moving on now to hospitality, because businesses in that sector are suffering from a rash of pre-Christmas cancellations and no-shows amid a rise in COVID-19 infections and fears over the Omicron variant. One venue told GB News it has lost 1,000 bookings in just a week and a half. Our East of England reporter Amelia Harper has the story.
The week before Christmas, a time when hospitality would make a quarter of its annual profits. Now businesses are yet again preparing for another quiet festive period due to COVID-19. UK hospitality warns as many as 10,000 sites could close if financial support isn't announced imminently. And the Prime Minister is still yet to decide whether to bring in more COVID restrictions. St Albans High Street, home to many pubs, bars and restaurants. Hospitality has been hit once again by the introduction of the new Omicron COVID variant. The sector normally relies on this time of year, but many places have seen a rise in cancellations and a lack of footfall through their venues. 50 metres in this direction is the White Swan, serving only drink. And 50 metres in this direction is the Peahen, serving both food and drink. So what's the situation for these two venues, just metres apart, off the same high street? Doors are open at the White Swan. It's a wet pub only and doesn't take bookings. Despite government messaging urging caution, it is still trading, but it's half of what it was before the pandemic.
Last night it was down 50%. I've been fortunate by staying in a wet situation pub, but for those that are going to try and recover and depend on the restaurant trade and the food trade, you know, I don't know how that's going to work for them. I can see closures here. You know, I've done my best to spend as much as I could to keep it afloat. I'm hoping my regulars will keep coming and it just carries on as a local.
On the other side of the high street, the Peahen is serving food. Normally tied up with bookings this close to Christmas, most have been cancelled.
It's really demoralising, actually. Going into Christmas, we were so excited, the team were buzzed, we were looking in for an amazing Christmas, and it started off so strong, and then we've just finished the last week now, and it's came in at about 33% below where we expected to be, which is quite a knock. Bookings-wise, in people, in total guests, we've lost over 1,000 people in just over a week and a half.
For now, all these businesses can do is prepare their venue for those that do come in. Boris Johnson says further restrictions to tackle the spread of Omicron are possible. And if that happens, hospitality will want more support to make sure they can keep their lights on. Amelia Harper, GB News, Hertfordshire.
Really interesting report there. Of course, not just questions of support for businesses during restrictions, but potentially questions of support for businesses with no restrictions at all because of behaviour changes amongst the people of the United Kingdom. Lots to be decided by the government this week. Well, that's it for me this morning on The Briefing. Coming up, it's To The Point with Patrick Christie's and Mercy Moroki. But first, here's a look at the weather.
It's time to remind ourselves there's always another winter. Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
Hello, a very good morning to you. I'm afraid I feel like a bit of a broken record again today, talking about more cloud for many of us. But one key difference, a better chance for some of sunshine emerging, certainly by the afternoon. At the moment, high pressure still firmly in control of our weather, but chilly easterly airflow brings cold conditions to many of us across the UK. It also brings some clear spells first thing as drier continental air drifts in. And as